close your eyes, let the weight of the day melt away, and allow your mind to drift far back into time. Tonight, we step quietly into the ancient world, a world before empires fell and rose again, before coins clinked in pockets, and before the pages of history were ever written. This is not a tale of kings and wars alone. It's a story of how humans lived, believed, how they loved, how they feared, and how they slowly began to understand the world around them. From the winding rivers of Egypt to the grand temples of Babylon, from myths carved in stone to the whispers of forgotten cities, we explore the calm beneath history's noise. This is history not told to impress, but to soothe, not to excite, but to ease you into rest. So lean back, let the past wrap around you like a soft blanket, and follow the quiet path into a world that once was. Welcome to a different kind of history, a history made for sleep, the life of Gautama Buddha. But now, let us drift back, not just a few years, but 3 long centuries further into the mists of time, to a moment when the world, in its quiet corners, was beginning to stir with great thought and gentle revolutions of the soul. In the heart of ancient India, beneath sun-soaked skies and sacred rivers, there walked a man whose teachings would echo through time, shaping not just one life, but millions. This man was Gautama Buddha. Not a conqueror, not a king, but a teacher, a guide, a soul lit by deep compassion and timeless wisdom. He sat among his followers in the ancient city of Benares, now Varanasi, sharing words that would challenge the very foundation of human suffering. And while his voice stirred the dust of Indian roads, far away in the great city of Babylon, a prophet named Isaiah was lifting his voice in longing and faith among the exiled Jews. Meanwhile, in Ephesus, under a different sky, a thinker named Heraclitus was wrestling with the very fabric of reality. 3 men in 3 distant lands, all alive in the same century, the 6th, before the Common Era. They never met, never heard each other's names, yet their thoughts, like seeds on the wind, would one day touch every corner of the earth. Unaware of one another, and yet, somehow, deeply connected. The 6th century before Christ was no ordinary chapter in the book of time. It was, in many ways, one of the most extraordinary moments in all of human history. Something was stirring quietly, yet powerfully in distant corners of the earth. Across vast lands, from the banks of the Ganges to the gardens of Babylon, from the streets of Ephesus to the river valleys of China, men's minds were beginning to shine with a new kind of boldness. It was not the boldness of armies, nor the pride of empires, but the courage to question, to rise from the familiar shadows of kings and priests, to step away from the rituals of blood and fire, and to ask, why? Why do we suffer? What is truth? Who are we beneath the names, beneath the flags, beneath the silence of the stars? It was as though humanity itself had reached a moment of awakening. After a long childhood of 20,000 years steeped in myths, in fears, in blind obedience, something had changed. A race, not yet grown, but no longer small. It was the adolescence of our species. The first brave steps toward understanding not just the world, but the self. And now, as we continue this quiet journey through time, we turn our gaze to the land of India once more. A place where history grows dim, like a lantern flickering behind a curtain of mist. For the early story of India is still shrouded in shadows. We do not know the exact hour or the names of the first to arrive, but perhaps, around 2,000 years before the birth of Christ, a wave of people came down from the northwest, Aryan-speaking, strong in spirit and tradition. They may have come in a single great surge, or perhaps in quiet waves over time. What we do know is that they brought with them a powerful voice, a language unlike any other. This language would come to be known as Sanskrit. As these newcomers moved across the fertile plains of the Indus and the Ganges, they encountered a people already settled, darker in skin, more intricate in culture, yet perhaps softer in resolve. A civilization that had built, dreamed, and lived long before the Aryans arrived. And yet, the meeting of these worlds was not as warm as it could have been. Unlike the mingling of Greeks and Persians, these Aryans remained apart, aloof, keeping their blood, their customs, their lives separate. And so, as the first clear outlines of India emerge from the fog of the forgotten, we already see a land divided, a society layered like the steps of an ancient temple. Each layer, each caste, with its own place, its own boundaries, its own silence. They would not eat together, nor marry, nor mix. And through the centuries, that deep separation would endure. India, unlike the free-breeding lands of Europe or Mongolia, became not one people, but many living side by side, yet worlds apart. A community of communities. Let us now return to the young man who would one day become the Buddha. Siddhartha Gautama, born into grace, the son of an aristocratic family nestled in the serene slopes of the Himalayas. He lived, as many would dream to live, among beauty and privilege, ruling a small, peaceful district, kissed by sunlight and song. At just 19, he married his cousin, a woman of rare beauty and quiet charm. Together they walked among the gardens, beneath flowering trees, past still ponds and whispering groves. He hunted in the forests, played beneath the open skies. The rice fields shimmered in the warmth, irrigated, golden, reflecting a life of ease. But even in this paradise, something stirred. Not in the wind, but within him, a quiet ache, a questioning that no celebration could drown. It was the sadness, not of loss, but of realization. The sorrow of a mind too bright, left unchallenged, a spirit too awake to keep pretending. He began to feel that all of this, the wealth, the laughter, the gentle routine, was not life itself. It was a dream, a beautiful one, yes, but still a dream. And that dream, it seemed, had gone on too long. And then something deeper began to press upon Gautama's heart. A shadow, not cast by clouds or trees, but by thought. The gentle joy of his world began to tremble beneath a rising awareness of sorrow, of impermanence. He began to see that beneath every smile, there lurked the quiet truth of pain, that behind the laughter of gardens waited the silence of loss. The world as bright and fragrant as it was felt suddenly fragile, temporary, insecure, a beautiful illusion, crumbling at its edges. He saw disease not just in body, but in spirit. He saw mortality, the inescapable truth that every breath must end. And even happiness seemed to fade too quickly, slipping like water through his fingers. It was in this mood, heavy with longing, stirred by unseen winds, that Gautama crossed paths with one of India's wandering ascetics. These men were seekers. They had renounced comfort, denied pleasure, choosing instead a path of solitude, meditation, and searching. Their lives were harsh, disciplined, quiet, and yet their eyes seemed to look inward, as if listening to something deeper than words. They were not escaping life, they were chasing something more. A truth, a stillness, a flame beneath the surface of all things. And in that encounter, something awakened within Gautama. A desire, no, a need, to follow that same path, to seek what lay beneath the dream, to find reality itself. It is said that as Gautama sat beneath the trees, deep in thought, weighed down by questions that stirred like winds through his soul, a messenger approached. News had come. His wife had given birth to their firstborn son, a moment that would bring joy to any father, a sacred thread of life extending into the future. But for Gautama, it brought a silence, not of celebration, but of sorrow. He looked out across the gardens, the shadows gently lengthening, and whispered quietly, "This is another tie to break." Not because he lacked love, but because he knew that every bond, no matter how precious, could also become a chain, a weight holding him back from the path he now felt called to walk, a path towards something vast, something eternal. And though his heart must have ached in that moment, he chose the unknown. He chose the journey, into silence, into solitude, into truth. Gautama returned to the village of his birth, and was welcomed with open arms. The air was filled with laughter, music, and the joyful noise of celebration. His clansmen rejoiced for a son had been born. There was feasting, dancing, a notch performance under lantern-lit skies, colors swirling, drums echoing in the night. But beneath it all, inside Gautama, there was no peace. While others celebrated, he sat alone with a storm in his soul. And in the quiet hours of the night, he awoke. Not gently, but suddenly, as if struck. Like a man who's been told that his house is on fire. It was agony, not of the body, but of spirit. A burning need to escape the golden cage, to cast off the comfort, the customs, the expectations, and to seek what lay beyond. His mind was made. Before dawn would rise, he would be gone. He walked softly down the stone corridors of his home to the door of his wife's chamber. There, in the soft flicker of a tiny oil lamp, he saw her, sleeping peacefully, flowers surrounding her like a painting, their child resting gently in her arms. His son, the one he would not watch, grow, and for a moment, time stood still. He ached to lift the child, to feel that warmth, just once, to leave behind a single kiss. But he did not. The fear of waking her, of hearing her voice, was too much to bear. So, he turned away, stepped silently into the silver moonlight of the Indian night, mounted his horse, and rode, away from all he had ever known, into the wide, waiting world. He rode far that night. The moon watched silently from above, as the world beneath him slipped quietly away, through forests and fields, through the cool hush of pre-dawn, until finally, when the first light of morning touched the earth, Gautama came to rest. He dismounted beside a sandy riverbank just beyond the lands of his clan. There, in that stillness, he performed a quiet act of transformation. He drew his sword, not in anger, but with resolve, and with a single solemn motion, he cut away his flowing hair, each strand falling like a farewell. He removed his ornaments, the symbols of wealth, of family, of name. He laid aside his sword and sent it all the horse, the jewels, the blade back to the life he had left behind. It would not return. As he walked on, he came across a ragged man, a stranger clothed in the dust of the road. And without hesitation, Gautama exchanged clothes with him. No longer a prince, no longer a husband, no longer a son. Only a seeker, unbound, unnamed, now truly free, to begin his journey. He made his way southward, where the great Vindhya mountains reached up like sleeping giants. There, nestled among the hills, was a quiet haven of caves, a place where hermits and teachers lived in silence and thought. They spoke little, taught only by word of mouth, to those who came, humbly, to listen. Gautama stayed among them, learning, absorbing, questioning. He became fluent in the metaphysics of the time, the deep and winding thoughts that had captured the minds of sages for generations. But something in him still stirred. His mind, sharp as a blade, could see through the riddles. And though he understood, he remained unsatisfied. The answers were not enough. The truth he sought still waited, just out of reach. In the world Gautama now wandered, there was a powerful belief, a belief that truth and power could be earned not through reason, but through suffering, that by denying the body, the soul might awaken. The Indian mind, ancient, vast, and mystical, had long held to this path. It taught that wisdom could be summoned through fasting, through sleepless nights, through pain that scoured the self of all illusion. And so, Gautama chose to walk that road. With 5 companions at his side, faithful disciples in search of the same hidden light, he retreated deep into the jungle. There, beneath the watchful trees and whispering winds, he gave himself to terrible penances. He starved, he endured. He pushed his body into silence, into stillness, into suffering. And the world began to take notice. His name drifted across the lands, not shouted, but ringing softly, like the sound of a great bell suspended in the canopy of the skies. People whispered of him, the ascetic prince, the man of bones and dust, chasing truth in shadows. But within him, there was no triumph, only emptiness. No revelation came. One day, weakened beyond imagining, he walked slowly, trying to think, trying to hold his mind above the drowning tide of exhaustion. And then, his body failed him. He collapsed a still figure against the earth, unconscious, fragile, broken. When he awoke, something inside him had shifted. Clarity, not from pain, but from its futility. The path he had taken, the denial, the torment, the magical thinking, had brought him no closer to the truth. And in that quiet realization, he understood. Wisdom would not be found in punishment, but in something deeper, something still waiting to be discovered. His companions, the 5 who had walked with him into the silence of the jungle, were stunned. They watched in disbelief as Gautama, once their beacon of discipline and denial, now asked for ordinary food. He sat and ate, no longer clinging to the harsh rituals that had once defined their path. He would not continue the mortifications. He would not starve. He would not suffer for suffering's sake. They could not understand. To them, it was betrayal. But for Gautama, it was awakening. He had come to a quiet, revolutionary truth that whatever wisdom a man might reach, he would reach it best through clarity. And clarity lives in a nourished mind, in a body that breathes fully and walks without pain. This idea, simple as it may sound, was radical. In that age, in that land, such a thought was unheard of. Strength through balance, enlightenment without agony, it defied everything. And so his disciples turned away, disappointed, confused, hearts heavy with sorrow. They left him and went back to Benares. And once again, Gautama was alone, not with bitterness, but with a quiet sense that his path was no longer theirs. His steps now belonged to something deeper, to a truth still forming, still just beyond the edge of thought. The mind, when faced with a great entangled question, does not leap toward answers all at once. It moves slowly, step by careful step across unseen bridges of thought. Often, it hardly notices how far it has come until suddenly, as if a curtain is pulled back, the light floods in, and everything becomes clear. So it was with Gautama. Wandering, weary, yet quietly whole, he came to rest beside a gentle river. There, under the shelter of a great tree, he sat to eat. Just a simple moment. Food, shade, water. But within him, something vast was stirring. And in that stillness, with the hum of the world fading to silence, it happened. A moment of illumination. Not loud, not dramatic, but complete. He saw life plain. The suffering, the longing, the illusion, and beyond it, the cause, and the path beyond the cause. He understood with a clarity that needed no voice. It is said that he sat there for a full day and through the quiet hours of the night, not asleep, not lost in thought, but present as if the universe had opened within him. And when he finally rose, it was not as the man who had wandered or starved or searched. He stood as one who had seen, and he knew the time had come to share this vision, to speak not of doctrine, but of truth, to offer the world not pain, but peace. And so his journey was no longer his alone. And so Gautama began to walk once more, but now not as a seeker, as a knower. He made his way to Benares, the ancient city where his 5 disciples had gone, burdened with disappointment and unanswered hopes. And when he found them, they saw something had changed. He no longer carried the silence of struggle. There was calm in his eyes and light in his words. Patiently, gently, he spoke to them, and slowly their doubt gave way to understanding. He had not failed them. He had found the path, and now they could walk it with him. In the quiet sanctuary of the King's Deer Park in Benares, they settled together. There, among the trees and sunlight, they built simple huts. Not palace, not temple, Just a humble place where thoughts could unfold, where hearts could listen. A school of sorts, not for memorizing, but for awakening. And people began to come, from dusty roads and distant lands, drawn not by miracles, but by the peace they felt in his presence. They came seeking wisdom, and in that grove, beneath the whispering leaves, they found it. The heart of Gautama's teaching began not in the stars, nor in the patterns of nature, but in a simple question. A question that has stirred within him long before he left his palace gates. Why am I not completely happy? He had wealth, comfort, love, a future paved with ease. And yet, a quiet ache had followed him like a shadow. It was an introspective question turned inward, not outward. Very different from the bold and curious minds of Greece, like Thales and Heraclitus, who sought to understand the universe through thought and logic. And unlike the prophets of the Hebrew tradition, who carried a heavy sense of moral duty, looking outward to the will of a higher God, Gautama did not forget the self. He turned toward it fully. He examined it gently, then fearlessly, and what he found became the foundation of his truth. All suffering, he taught, flows from one root, the cravings of the individual self, the thirst to have, to be, to hold on to what must pass. Until man frees himself from these desires, his life will be filled with unrest, his days uneasy, his end sorrowful. He spoke of 3 great cravings, each one a trap that binds the soul. First, the desire of the appetites, hunger, greed, and every longing of the flesh. Second, the desire for a personal immortality, a clinging to the ego, the self that wishes to last forever. And third, the craving for success, for power, for worldly gain, avarice, ambition, and pride. These, all of them, were poison. To be free, one must let them go. Only when desire is extinguished, when the self dissolves like mist in the morning sun, then and only then does serenity come. This peace, this stillness, is called nirvana, not a place, but a state of being, where the fires of longing no longer burn, where the soul rests, and the highest good is finally reached. This was the heart of his teaching, delicate, profound, a truth not easily grasped, wrapped in subtlety, born of deep reflection. It was not like the clear call of the Greeks, who urged men to see and know fearlessly, to understand the world through bold inquiry. Nor was it like the stern command of the Hebrew prophets, who spoke of righteousness and the fear of God. No, this was something more inward, more elusive. Gautama's vision required not just obedience, but transformation. Not just knowledge, but the undoing of self. It was not a path for the faint of heart. Even those closest to him, his own disciples, struggled to fully understand the depth of what he offered. And so, it is not surprising that after he was gone, the light of his truth began to flicker and bend. Without his presence, his clarity, his calm voice to guide them, the purity of his message slowly began to change. India at that time already held a belief that once in long ages, wisdom itself would take form, that it would walk the earth, clothed in human flesh, as a Buddha. And so, Gautama's followers, in awe of his peace, his insight, his extraordinary stillness, began to declare that he was one of them, that he was the Buddha. Whether Gautama himself ever claimed that title, we cannot say. There is no record of such a claim, but after his death, the world did what the human heart so often does. It reached for wonder. It wrapped his life in legend, wrapped his teachings in miracles. Because the human heart too often prefers a story of magic to the quiet, hard work of moral effort. And so, the man who had walked barefoot among thorns, who had looked into suffering and dared to face it, became something else, something distant, something wonderful. And yet, even as the legends grew, even as Gautama's quiet life was draped in the shimmer of myths and miracles, something real remained, something lasting, a seed that would not vanish with time. For while nirvana, that high stillness, may have been too distant, too abstract for most minds to grasp, and while the world clung tightly to its love of wonder stories, there was still one part of Gautama's teaching that stayed close to the earth, something that could be understood and lived. It was called the Eightfold Way, also known as the Aryan Path or the Noble Path, a simple, clear road, not paved with miracles but with choices, with the steady light of inner discipline. It asked for no temple, no blood, no divine favor, only this: right thinking, right speaking, right conduct, a life of honest livelihood, a life of restraint, of clarity, of compassion. In it, there was a call to straighten the mind, to purify intention, to lift the conscience from sleep. It asked men and women to aim not for personal glory, but for something far more beautiful: a generous life, a self-forgetting heart, not lost in ritual, but alive with purpose. And though many would forget the man, though the myths would swell and swirl, this path remained, a light still shining on the quiet road to peace. Primitive thought. And now, let us gently drift into a quiet speculation, a thought so ancient, it echoes beyond the edge of memory. What must it have felt like to be human in the earliest days of our long, winding journey? Picture it: a time before cities, before stories were ever written down, a time when the world was vast and wild, and man was simply a wanderer beneath the stars. How did they think, those ancient souls? What stirred in their minds as they roamed across hills and forests, hunting, seeking, surviving some 400 centuries ago? This was long before the rhythm of farming, before seed met soil, before the quiet trust of harvest. No letters etched in clay, no ink on scrolls, nothing preserved, only silence. And so we are left with whispers, fragile clues, and scattered traces. We guess, we imagine, we feel our way backward through time, like hands reaching out in the dark toward a flicker of understanding. To reach back into that hidden world of early human thought, scientists have followed many winding paths. Their search has been wide and varied, touching on clues scattered across time. One of the most revealing lights comes from the quiet, intricate world of psychoanalysis, a science that peeks into the inner mind, exploring how the wild impulses of childhood are gently shaped, softened, and restrained to fit the delicate patterns of society. Through this lens, we glimpse something familiar, something ancient. It offers reflections not just of individual minds, but of entire early societies learning to live together, to manage desire, to form order. Then there are the remaining echoes found in the lives of present-day tribal peoples, those few who still live in ways close to our distant ancestors. Their customs and beliefs, their fears and stories, all whisper back across the centuries. And still more, we find remnants fossilized not in stone, but in the old tales passed from lip to ear: the folklore, the superstitions, the strange rituals that linger even now, nestled quietly in the corners of modern life. And as we move closer to our own age, the voices grow stronger. Statues, symbols, carvings, ancient paintings on cave walls. Through them, we see more clearly what caught the ancient eye, what stirred the ancient heart, what they chose to draw, to shape, to remember. These are the first sparks of recorded wonder, the earliest footprints of the human soul. In those early days, it's likely that primitive man thought in much the same way a child does today, through vivid, flickering images born in the mind. His thoughts weren't shaped by logic or structure, but by feelings, visions, and raw emotion. He didn't reason his way through the world, he imagined it. Pictures would rise unbidden in his mind, full of movement and wonder, and he would act not from thought, but from what those images stirred in his heart. Even now, we can see glimpses of this in the way a child responds to a shadow, or how someone untrained in reason reacts with instinct instead of analysis. True, careful thinking, the kind that sorts ideas, that questions, weighs, and plans, came much later. In fact, it's only been within the last 3,000 years or so that humanity began to use thought systematically as a tool. And even now, in this modern world of cities and satellites, only a few truly live with disciplined minds. Most still drift, as our ancestors did, moved by imagination, carried by emotion, led by the stories and pictures that rise within. As the true human story slowly began to unfold, The earliest societies were likely small and intimate, not yet nations or villages, but simple family groups bound together by blood and survival. Much like the flocks and herds of earlier mammals, these early human tribes likely began with families that stayed close, growing slowly in number. But for such togetherness to last, something profound had to change within the heart of man. The fierce, selfish instincts, the primitive ego had to be softened. The natural fear of a dominant father and the quiet respect for a nurturing mother had to stretch beyond childhood and shape adult life. The jealous tension that grew between older males and the younger, rising ones had to be soothed and controlled. Through all this, the mother wise, steady, and protective stood as the guide for the young. And so, out of the delicate pull between wild independence and the danger of being alone, human social life began to take shape. It was a fragile balance between the youthful urge to wander off and pair alone, and the unspoken understanding that safety lay in staying close. One brilliant mind, the anthropologist J.J. Atkinson, in his work Primal Law, traced these early laws, the strange taboos and customs of tribal people back to this quiet struggle, this early attempt to live together in peace. And later, psychoanalysts would echo his vision, uncovering how deeply those ancient compromises still echo within us carried forward, quietly, in the soul of humanity. Some thinkers, those who dare to wander deeper into the misty corners of human thought, have suggested a fascinating idea. They believe that the roots of religion itself may have begun in the deep emotions felt toward the figures of early life, especially the old man, the patriarch, who inspired both fear and awe, and the protective, nurturing woman, a mother or elder, who stirred deep feelings of comfort and dependence. These early emotional bonds, magnified in dreams, twisted through imagination, and played upon by the primitive mind, may have bloomed into something greater, something sacred. When these powerful figures died, their memory did not fade. Instead, they returned not in body, but in the silent, vivid theater of dreams. And so it became easy, even natural, for early humans to believe that these figures weren't truly gone. Perhaps they had simply moved elsewhere to a mysterious place, far off, where they had become even more powerful. Their presence, now unreachable by day, was still alive at night. And slowly, reverence grew. The old man became more than just a father. He became a spirit, a god. The wise woman was no longer just a protector. She became a goddess. And thus, from memory, emotion, and the eerie truth of dreams, the first whispers of religion may have taken shape. The dreams, the fears, and the wild imaginations of a child, they are vivid, bright, and impossibly real. And primitive man in many ways was still like a child. His mind was raw and open, his emotions untamed. He hadn't yet grown into the cold distance of modern thought. He was close to the animals, not just in body, but in spirit. He could believe that they thought and felt as he did, that a wolf might feel jealousy, a bird might offer help, a bear might become a god. The world around him was alive, not just in sound and motion, but in meaning. A strangely shaped rock, a gnarled tree, a piece of driftwood with an odd twist. These were not just things. To him, they were signs. They whispered stories. And when night fell and dreams took over, those stories came to life. What he saw in his sleep, he believed with all his heart. And slowly, stories were born rich with wonder, passed from lips to listening ears. The women, the mothers would tell these tales to the children again and again until they rooted deep, until they became tradition. Even now, if you watch a child lost in play, you'll see this magic, long, winding tales built around a doll, a toy, or a made-up creature. The difference is, primitive man believed his stories. He believed the doll was alive, the tree was listening, the animal was a guide. And in that belief, he built the first myths, not just to entertain, but to make sense of the mystery that was life. The earliest true humans we know of were, it seems, surprisingly talkative. In fact, it may have been this gift of speech, even in its simplest form, that set them apart from their silent cousins, the Neanderthals. Where the Neanderthal may have grunted and gestured like an animal, early humans likely shared words small, scattered words perhaps, but enough to name, to call, to connect. Their language was not rich or flowing. It was probably just a humble handful of names, rough sounds shaped by need. Still, those few words were powerful. They opened a window from one mind to another. Gestures filled the gaps: a pointed hand, a tilted head, a nod, and together with voice, they created meaning. Through this primitive speech, they began to share their world, to name the things they feared, to call out to those they loved, to describe the visions in their dreams. It was a fragile language, soft and uncertain, but it was language all the same. And with it, humanity stepped one quiet pace further away from the beast and closer to becoming something more. Even in the earliest, most primitive tribes, no matter how far removed from what we call civilization, there was always some kind of understanding, however faint, of cause and effect. The idea that one thing leads to another was not lost on early man. But his world was full of mystery, and his conclusions were often mistaken. He didn't yet have tools to test, to question, to prove. So he guessed, he believed, and often he believed the wrong things. Do this, he thought, and that will happen. Sometimes he was right, like when a child ate a poisonous berry and died. That was clear, immediate, undeniable. But other times, the connections he made were illusions. He might eat the heart of a brave enemy, thinking it would give him courage. It seemed to make sense, but it wasn't true. Still, to him, this was knowledge. This was science. We now call it fetish, a term for the early system of belief built around such cause and effect thinking. But at its core, it was simply savage science, rough, untested, and filled with error. Unlike modern science, it lacked structure, lacked doubt, and lacked method. Yet, it was a beginning, a first reach toward understanding in a world that still held more questions than answers. There were times when the link between cause and effect was clear, even to the primitive mind. A fire burns when touched. Rain follows dark clouds. In many simple things, early man could learn by doing, by trial, by error, by watching what worked and what did not. And sometimes, when his ideas were wrong, experience gently corrected him. But there were other matters deeper, more troubling matters where the truth was hidden and the guesses were long, winding, and often wrong. These were things that truly mattered to him. Things like the success of the hunt, the appearance of fish in the rivers, or the health of his family. When food was scarce, when game seemed to vanish, he searched his world for answers, desperate for patterns, for meaning. And so, he turned to charms, to omens, to whispered incantations under his breath. He believed that certain actions might summon luck, that a word or a sign might sway the spirits. Illness, too, haunted him. Sometimes it came like a shadow across the land, an invisible sickness that moved from one hut to the next. Other times, it struck suddenly, silently, without warning. A man would fall weak or die with no clear reason. To a mind still shaped by dream and emotion, this was terrifying. And so he searched for someone or something to blame. A beast, a neighbor, a tree, a wind. His thoughts raced like a child's, quick to fear, eager to explain, longing to feel some control in a world that often seemed wild and cruel. And in that panic, he built stories not because they were true, but because they helped him believe he understood. In time, among the small human tribes huddled together under the stars, certain minds began to stand out, older, calmer, more commanding. These individuals felt the same fears, dreamed the same dreams, imagined the same strange causes, but they were steadier. And when others panicked, they spoke with quiet authority. They began to advise, to guide, to decide. This sign meant danger. That sign meant luck. A bird flying this way, a crack in the firewood, a shadow in the sky, all were read and declared as omens. From these early voices rose the first figure of power, the expert in the unknown, the interpreter of signs, the medicine man. He was the first priest, not in the sense we think of priests today, but as a keeper of practice, of ritual, of the tribe's delicate, fearful balance with the invisible world. He spoke with certainty where there was none. He warned of misfortune. He promised protection. He performed the strange acts, the chants, the marks in the dirt that gave people comfort, the hocus pocus that made sense of chaos. This early religion wasn't about gods in the sky or holy books. It was daily survival, shaped by rules and observances. And in those rules, this early priest created something like science, but it was a science of feeling, of signs, of belief. Arbitrary, yes, but powerful, because it gave the tribe something to hold on to in a world they were only beginning to understand. The first seagoing peoples. Long ago, perhaps 25, maybe even 30,000 years in the past, mankind first touched the surface of the water not just to drink from it or fish beside it, but to float upon it. The earliest boats were not crafted with precision or plans. They were simple, primitive, a log rolled into the river, an inflated animal skin tied to the body, something that kept a man from sinking as he paddled across a stream or followed a shoreline. By the time we step into the Neolithic age, these floating tools had already become part of life. In the cradle lands of Egypt and Sumeria, ancient hands shaped boats from basket frames, stretched animal skin over them, and sealed the gaps with care. And though time has marched forward, the simplicity of that design still survives. Even today, in the quiet waters of Ireland, in the mists of Wales, in the icy stretches of Alaska boats, much like those of the ancient world, are still used. Sealskin vessels still brave the crossing of the Bering Strait, just as they did thousands of years ago. As tools improved, the hollow log followed, carved carefully, shaped with purpose. And from those humble beginnings, the boat slowly grew into the ship. Each step was natural, each invention a quiet response to the need to move, to cross, to explore. It was the beginning of something vast, not just travel, but connection. The first steps upon the water, taken by man with nothing but courage and a crude vessel, opened the way to the wide, waiting world beyond the shore. Perhaps, nestled within the ancient legend of Noah's Ark, there lingers a distant memory not just of faith, but of craftsmanship. A tale passed through generations, maybe first whispered beside a fire under the stars, may in truth be a faint echo of some early triumph in shipbuilding. The image of a great vessel, built with care and hope, braving a world of rising waters, might reflect more than myth. Across many cultures from distant lands and forgotten tribes, there are stories of a great flood, of waters swallowing the earth, of survival upon the sea. Could these scattered tales all be remembering the same moment? Some believe they echo the ancient flooding of the Mediterranean basin, when sea rushed through the narrow land and reshaped the world, and just maybe someone or many someone survived that flood, built something strong, sailed something brave, and left behind a story that would never fully fade, only grow grander with time. Long before the towering pyramids rose from the sands of Egypt, long before written words etched the story of kings and gods, ships were already gliding across the waters of the Red Sea. By 7000 BC, the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf had already welcomed their share of sails and paddles. Most of these early vessels belonged to humble fishermen, quiet seekers of food from the deep. But not all. Among them, there were ships with bolder hearts. Some carried goods from shore to shore, beginning the long tale of trade. Others, perhaps, came with darker purpose. For if history has shown us anything about mankind, it is that where trade flows, temptation follows. And so it's easy to imagine that even the first sailors, their boats creaking across the waves, learned to take what they could when no one watched, and barter only when they must. The sea was wide, the rules were few, and men as ever were both dreamers and opportunists. The oceans were not just highways for goods, they were early theaters of risk, of chance, of courage, and sometimes of greed. The seas that cradled these first ships were not the vast open oceans we imagine today, but smaller, gentler inland waters, places like the Mediterranean, where the wind could be fickle, playful one moment, and absent the next. For days at a time, the sails would hang limp, waiting for breath. And so, in those early days, sailing remained just a helper, a quiet companion to the real force behind movement, the oar. It wasn't until the last 400 years that the true ocean-going sailing ship, rigged with skill and power, would come into being. In ancient times, ships were built to be rowed and rowed hard. They stayed close to the shore, afraid of the open sea, always ready to flee at the first hint of a storm. As these vessels grew larger, transforming into the mighty galleys of old, they demanded more and more human strength to move them forward. And so began a grim tradition, the capture of men in war, not just to conquer, but to chain them to the oars. Galley slaves, human engines rowing day and night beneath the deck, pushing their masters across the waves. It was the price of power on the water, and it was paid in sweat, pain, and silence. We've already met the Semitic people first as nomads, wandering the dry stretches of Syria and Arabia, and then as conquerors, rising to power in the fertile lands of Sumeria, where they built the Akkadian Empire, and later, the first great Babylonian state. But their story didn't end with desert sands and city walls. In the west, these same Semitic tribes turned their gaze to the sea. They began to settle along the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, building a chain of harbor towns, the most famous, among them being Tyre and Sidon. These ports soon became vibrant centers of trade and adventure. By the time Hammurabi ruled in Babylon, these bold seafarers, now known as the Phoenicians, had already spread across the entire Mediterranean basin. They were traders, wanderers, and colonizers. Westward they sailed, settling in distant Spain, pushing aside the older Iberian peoples like the Basques, and navigating through the narrow straits of Gibraltar with their coastal fleets. Southward, they reached the northern coast of Africa, planting new cities, new footholds. Among those early colonies was one name that would echo through history: Carthage, a city that began as a Phoenician outpost and would one day become a mighty rival to Rome. But that is a story for another night. Though the Phoenicians carved a legendary path across the Mediterranean, they were not the first to glide their galleys through those ancient waters. Long before them, the sea was already alive with the presence of other sailors, people who built towns and cities on the coasts and islands, quietly thriving beneath the sun. These were the Aegean peoples, a mysterious race or collection of races, whose bloodlines and languages seemed to link them to the Basques in the far west and to the Berbers and Egyptians in the south. They lived long before the Greeks, long before the names we often remember took their place on history's stage. And yet, they had cities in the very lands we now call Greece and Asia Minor, Mycenae, Troy. Places that would one day be wrapped in myth and legend were already alive, with trade, with life, with story. But perhaps the most remarkable of all was their great establishment at Knossos, on the island of Crete. There, the Aegean world blossomed not with war, but with beauty, art, and movement. These were the first true sea people of the Mediterranean, the quiet architects of a forgotten age. It is only in the most recent whispers of time, the last half-century, that the buried world of the Aegean peoples has truly begun to speak again. Thanks to the patient work of archaeologists, digging carefully through layers of earth and centuries, we now know just how far-reaching and advanced their civilization truly was. Of all their ancient cities, it is Knossos, on the island of Crete, that has offered us the clearest window into their forgotten world. Unlike other places, Knossos was not built over by later empires, not swallowed by newer cities that would erase the past. Its ruins lay waiting, undisturbed, sleeping quietly beneath the soil. And because of that rare luck, it has become our most precious source, a keyhole into a time once almost lost, into a people who shaped the early Mediterranean long before their names were written in the history books. Through Knossos, the silence of the Aegean peoples has turned, at last, into story. The story of Knossos stretches deep into the past, as far back, in fact, as the mighty and ancient civilization of Egypt. These two worlds, separated by sea but bound by curiosity and commerce, were already trading with one another as early as 4000 BC. Across quiet waves, ships carried goods, ideas, and dreams between their distant shores, and by 2500 BC, a time nestled between the reigns of Sargon I and Hammurabi in Mesopotamia, the civilization of Crete had reached its golden age. Knossos stood at its peak, vibrant and alive, a beacon of elegance and power in the heart of the Mediterranean. While other lands built empires with swords and conquests, Knossos seemed to shine with a different light, one of beauty, trade, and artistic grace. It was the height of Aegean civilization, a moment in time when Crete was not just a place on a map, but a center of the world. Knossos was unlike the cities we often imagine when we think of the ancient world. It was not a fortress of stone and war, but more like a vast, unfolding palace, a graceful home for the Cretan monarch and his people. There were no great walls to guard it, no looming towers of defense. For a long time, it didn't need them. It stood in peace, trusting in the rhythm of the sea and the balance of trade. But as time passed, the world around it began to shift. The Phoenicians grew stronger, bold sailors and traders who also knew the sharp edge of ambition. And from the north, a new presence stirred upon the waters: the Greeks. Fiercer, hungrier, and far more warlike, these newcomers were not content with peaceful exchange. They brought with them a different spirit, one of conquest and raids. And so, at last, Knossos had to change. The walls rose. The palace braced itself. A dream once open to the sea began to close as the calm days of Crete slowly gave way to the coming storm. The ruler of this shining Cretan world was called Minos, just as the ruler of Egypt was called Pharaoh. It wasn't a personal name, but a title of kingship worn by those who ruled over a people wrapped in elegance and grace. His palace at Knossos was unlike anything the ancient world had known. It had running water, yes, running water with flowing systems, real bathrooms, and comforts that would not be seen again for thousands of years. Within its walls, the king held great festivals, vivid and alive with energy. There was bullfighting, strikingly similar to the kind still seen today in Spain, right down to the colorful, flared costumes of the daring fighters. There were acrobats, gymnasts, tumblers who flipped and leapt through the air. And the women of Crete, bold and refined, wore clothing that would not seem out of place in our own age. Corsets, flounced skirts, dresses that shaped and flowed. Their artistry knew no bounds. The Cretans shaped clay into exquisite pottery, spun fine textiles, carved ivory, cast metal, painted walls with beauty, and worked with gold and jewels in ways that still catch the breath. They even had writing symbols and signs that remain, to this day, undeciphered, a forgotten language of a brilliant people still waiting in silence to speak again. This bright and graceful way of life in Knossos lasted not for a moment, but for centuries. For hundreds of years, the palace hummed with warmth, and the people of Crete lived in what must have felt like a golden age. Around 2000 BC, both Knossos and Babylon were thriving places filled with comfort, beauty, and a sense of peace. The people there likely lived gently surrounded by art, shows, and festivals filled with music and ritual. They had servants to tend to their needs and laborers to keep the wheels of trade and wealth turning. To them, life must have felt secure, wrapped in sunlight, surrounded by the deep blue sea. It was a world that seemed to promise stability. Egypt, by comparison, appeared to be fading under the strange and foreign rule of the shepherd kings seen as half barbaric by the polished people of Crete. And if one cared to notice the shifting winds of power, there was one clear pattern. The Semitic peoples were rising everywhere. They ruled in Egypt, stretched their influence to Babylon, built new cities like Nineveh high on the Tigris, and sailed boldly westward through the Pillars of Hercules, the straits we now call Gibraltar, planting colonies on far and unfamiliar shores. It must have seemed like they were quietly taking the world while the sun still shone peacefully over Crete. In the quiet brilliance of Knossos, not all minds were content with comfort alone. There were those curious, restless, filled with wonder who dreamed beyond the limits of earth and sea. And though the centuries have blurred their names, one figure survives in legend, Daedalus, the master craftsman of Crete. The Greeks who came later spoke of him with awe, a Cretan artificer so skilled, so clever, that he dared to challenge the very air itself. They told of how he built wings, perhaps a glider, and tried to fly. A man reaching skyward with the tools of his own hands. But the attempt, as the story goes, ended in failure. The sky would not yet be tamed. The machine collapsed, and Daedalus, or perhaps his son, fell into the sea. Still, in that tale, we see a glimpse of something real, a spirit of invention, a hunger to know, alive even then in the minds of ancient Crete. And though the flight failed, the dream soared a dream that would rise again, centuries later, on new wings. It's fascinating to pause and reflect on how the world of Knossos, for all its beauty and advancement, was both strikingly similar to our own, and yet deeply different. Imagine a Cretan gentleman walking the polished halls of the palace in 2500 BC. To him, iron was not the everyday material we take for granted. It was rare, mysterious, it came from the sky, quite literally only known through fragments of meteorites. It was a curiosity, not yet the backbone of tools, weapons, and machines. And the horse, such a familiar creature to us, would have seemed almost mythical to him. A kind of powerful super ass whispered about in tales from the far northern wilderness beyond the Black Sea. For that man of Crete, civilization centered around the Aegean in Greece, Asia Minor, where peoples like the Lydians, Carians, and Trojans lived and spoke languages not so different from his own. He had heard of Phoenician outposts in Spain, of distant lands in North Africa, but they were like shadows in his mind, remote and vague. Italy to him was a wild, forested place, unknown and untouched. And then, one day perhaps, he walked down to the harbor and noticed a strange new captive, a man with fair skin and bright blue eyes, who spoke in a wild, unintelligible tongue. The Cretan may have stared in curiosity, trying to speak, only to be met with a language he could not begin to understand. That foreigner came from far beyond the Black Sea, a land of tribes and unknown customs. To the Cretan, he seemed a savage. But in truth, that blue-eyed stranger was part of something greater, an Aryan tribesman, from a people whose languages would someday become the voices of the world. Sanskrit, Persian, Greek, Latin, German, English, all hidden in the echoes of that strange, unintelligible sound, a quiet meeting at a harbor between a fading world and a rising one. Such was Knossos at its height, intelligent, full of life, shining with color and joy. It was a place of elegance and invention, of music, art, and gentle light. But like so many beautiful things in history, its golden days did not last forever. Around 1400 BC, disaster struck. Perhaps it came suddenly, like a thief in the night. The great palace of Minos, once a symbol of power and peace, was destroyed. From that day to this, its ruins have remained silent, never rebuilt, never re-inhabited. What happened? We still do not know for certain. The archaeologists found signs of fire, of scattered treasures that looked like they had been looted in haste, as if someone had come with fury and taken what they could before vanishing. But they also found something deeper. Older, the unmistakable scars of a violent earthquake. Maybe nature herself shattered the palace walls. Or perhaps the earth shook first, and the Greeks, fierce and rising from the north, came after, finishing what the trembling ground began. However it happened, the age of Knossos ended not with ceremony, but in ash, in silence, in ruin. A light had gone out, and the world moved on. Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria. The story now shifts from the quiet ruins of Crete to the golden sands of Egypt, where the river Nile winds through the heart of a land both ancient and proud. The Egyptians, though once subdued by the foreign rule of Semitic shepherd kings, the Hyksos had never fully bowed their heads, and around 1600 BC, that quiet resistance surged into action. A fierce wave of patriotism swept across the land, and the foreign rulers were driven out. Egypt rose again stronger, more united, more determined. This powerful revival marked the beginning of what scholars now call the New Empire. Before the Hyksos came, Egypt had not been truly unified. But now, forged in the fire of occupation and rebellion, the nation stood as one. And with unity came a sharpened spirit, a new hunger for strength, for expansion. The pharaohs of this era were no longer content to rule in peace. They became warriors, commanders, conquerors. From the Hyksos, Egypt had learned the secrets of the war chariot and the swift, powerful warhorse tools that would now be turned outward. Under mighty rulers like Thothmes III and Amenophis III, the Egyptian banners marched eastward, far beyond their old borders, stretching as far as the Euphrates River. Egypt was no longer simply a land of pyramids and priests, it had become an empire. We now enter a long and restless chapter in the ancient world, 1,000 years of rising and falling, of battles that echoed across deserts and rivers. Once separate, the two great civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt now began to collide. In the beginning, it was Egypt that held the upper hand. The mighty 17th dynasty brought forth names still remembered in stone: Thothmes III, Amenophis III and IV, and the powerful queen Hattusa, who ruled with a firm yet graceful hand. Later came the 19th dynasty, when Ramses II, perhaps the very pharaoh who stood face to face with Moses, reigned for 67 long years, lifting Egypt to glory. But these heights were not permanent. Between the golden ages came shadows. Egypt fell under Syrian rule, and later, from the southern deserts, the Ethiopians came and held the throne. Meanwhile, the lands of Mesopotamia saw their own changes. Babylon thrived, then faded. The Hittites rose like a flame, and the Syrians of Damascus briefly held power. At one moment, Syrian kings conquered Egypt itself, and then came the Assyrians of Nineveh, fierce and relentless. Sometimes, they were the conquerors, marching through Babylon and threatening Egypt, and other times, they were the conquered, their city trembling under foreign banners. These were times of endless marches, of empires breathing and breaking. Armies moved like tides, now rising, now retreating, and in their ranks, war chariots thundered across the earth pulled by horses, noble and swift, who were still used only for battle and glory. They had come from Central Asia, and now they had become the proud engine of war across two great worlds. As the centuries rolled on, shadowy figures rose out of the mist of time conquerors whose names, though faint, still echo in the stones of history. Tushratta, the king of Mitanni, once captured the great city of Nineveh. Then came Tiglath-Pileser I of Assyria, who pressed even farther and took Babylon itself. But it was later, under Tiglath-Pileser III, that Assyria truly became the dominant power of its age. In 745 BC, he seized Babylon and laid the foundation for what we now call the New Assyrian Empire, a kingdom not just of wealth and walls, but of iron and war. For now, something new had entered civilization. Iron. No longer rare, no longer falling only from the sky, it had come south from the mountains, first used by the Hittites, early ancestors of the Armenians, and passed into Assyrian hands. With it came sharper weapons, harder tools, and armies more deadly than before. Sargon II, a usurper who claimed the Assyrian throne, armed his soldiers in iron and carved a new doctrine into the world, that strength, not wisdom, would rule, that blood and iron would decide the fate of nations. His son, Sennacherib, carried this vision to the borders of Egypt, only to be turned back not by swords, but by plague. Nature herself had drawn the line, but the ambition did not end. Sennacherib's grandson, the fearsome Assurbanipal, known to the Greeks as Sardanapalus, finally marched into Egypt in 670 BC. Yet even this victory rang hollow. Egypt had already fallen, ruled now by an Ethiopian dynasty, and so Sardanapalus merely changed the face of power, one conqueror stepping in where another had stood. The winds of history had shifted, but the world remained restless. If we could gently flip through a series of old political maps tracing the long and tangled stretch of these 1,000 years, we'd see a world in constant motion. Egypt would expand and shrink like a living creature under a lens, swelling with victory and then drawing inward in retreat. Around it, the Semitic powers Babylon, Assyria, the Hittites, and the Syrians would rise like waves, only to crash into one another, swallowing and spitting each other out in an endless dance of conquest and collapse. West of Asia Minor, tiny Aegean kingdoms like Lydia, with its capital at Sardis and Caria, would flicker on the edge of the map like scattered stars. But something new was beginning to stir. From the northeast, and from the wide forests of the northwest, unfamiliar names began to appear, names of fierce, iron-armed tribes riding in on war chariots. They did not come to trade, nor to learn. They came like a storm. These were the early Aryans, a scattered family of tribes who all spoke distant echoes of the same tongue. Their language would someday become many things, but now it was the voice of something wild, untamed, and rising. They were pressing in upon the older worlds, upon the Aegean kingdoms, upon the Semitic cities, and the ancient world could feel their footsteps growing louder along its borders. Around the northeast edges of the Black Sea and the vast Caspian, new waves of people were beginning to move, the Medes and the Persians, fierce and growing in strength. Their names at times blurred together in the ancient records with other wild tribes, the Scythians and the Sarmatians, who thundered across the plains. From the same wide lands came the Armenians, while from the forests and passes of the northwest through the rugged Balkan Peninsula came the Cimmerians, the Phrygians, and the first stirrings of the people we now know as the Greeks. These were the Aryans east and west, a family of kindred tribes, rough and resilient, born from herds and horses, who had turned from farming to raiding. In the east, they were still on the edges, skirmishers and border raiders. But in the west, they had begun to break through. Cities fell beneath them, and the once settled and artistic Aegean peoples were being driven from their homes. Those displaced, desperate for safety, looked outward. Some turned toward the Nile, trying to find new lands in Egypt's delta only to be pushed back by its defenders. Others, the people we now call the Etruscans, set sail from Asia Minor and vanished into the forested heart of Italy, where they would build a new life. Still more journeyed south and east. building cities on the Mediterranean coast, a people who would later be remembered in history as the Philistines. All across the edges of the old world, the pressure of the new was growing. The wild had come down from the hills, and the ancient cities trembled. These Aryans, these bold newcomers who burst so suddenly into the quiet worlds of older civilizations, will have their story told more fully in time. For now, we simply pause and observe the great motion they set in place. Between 1600 and 600 BC, across 1,000 years, they came steadily from the northern forest, from the deep wildernesses of Europe and Asia, flowing like a restless wind into the lands of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Aegean world. Their coming was not just a single event, but a slow, swirling advance, a wave of migrations, raids, and resettlements that stirred the settled soil of history. Old cities were shaken, new names appeared, and the ancient world, once still and familiar, found itself changing, year after year, under the quiet pressure of these iron-armed strangers. A new chapter was beginning, and the echoes of the past began to fade into something different, something unknown. And before we leave this chapter of shifting powers and rising tribes, we must pause to notice a small and quiet people, one that, though modest in number, would come to shape the thoughts of distant centuries. In the hills behind the bustling Phoenician ports and the cities of the Philistines, there lived a Semitic people, the Hebrews. Toward the end of this long era of migration and upheaval, their presence began to take on new meaning. Though they were not an empire, not a conquering force with chariots or iron, they were gathering something deeper, a voice. From their lives, their questions, their struggles, they began to shape a literature unlike any the world had seen. It was not merely history or legend, but a woven tapestry of wisdom, poetry, prophecy, and belief, a sacred collection of writings we now know as the Hebrew Bible. Quietly, these words would endure, and one day, they would speak to the hearts of people far beyond those ancient hills. Though great changes were sweeping across the outer edges of the ancient world, in the heartlands of civilization in Mesopotamia and Egypt, life flowed with a deeper rhythm. The coming of the Aryans, though significant, did not bring sudden transformation to these old and settled lands, at least not until after 600 BC. For the people of Babylon and the citizens of Egypt, the fall of distant Knossos and the flight of the Aegeans must have felt like distant ripples on a far-off shore. Dynasties rose and fell, as they always had, but the daily pattern of life, the traditions, the ceremonies, the slow growth of knowledge and artistry continued, almost undisturbed. With each passing century, the fabric of life became more intricate, more refined. In Egypt, the ancient pyramids, already standing for nearly 3,000 years, were visited and admired just as they are today, while new marvels were built to join them. The majestic temples of Karnak and Luxor, their columns tall and proud, rose under the vision of the pharaohs of the 17th and 19th dynasties. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, the great cities like Nineveh flourished in splendor. The massive winged bulls with human faces, the grand reliefs of kings riding into battle or hunting lions, all were crafted during these same centuries, from 1600 to 600 BC. It was also a time of glory for Babylon, whose shining towers and lush gardens stood as a testament to human wonder. Though the winds of change stirred the world beyond, here in these cradles of civilization, the soul of the ancient world still lived and breathed, quietly but powerfully. From this time onward, both in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, the echoes of life become clearer. Public records were kept, accounts were written, letters exchanged, and poems composed, all preserved in clay, in ink, or carved in stone. We now glimpse their world not just through ruins, but through words. And what those words reveal is a life remarkably familiar, especially for those fortunate enough to be wealthy and influential. In the great cities of Babylon and Thebes, the prosperous lived with grace and luxury. Their homes were grand, adorned with art, furnished with beauty. They wore elegant garments embroidered with color and jewels that glimmered in the desert sun. Life moved with ceremony, feasts and festivals were frequent. Music and dance filled their gatherings, and skilled servants ensured every detail was attended to. There were physicians for the sick and dentists for the aching tooth. Travel was rare, but not unknown. When the weather was kind, they would take to the water, sailing gently down the Nile or the Euphrates, watching the world drift by in silence. The animals of burden were humble, The donkey bore most of the load, while the horse, still a creature of war and royal display, stood apart. The mule was a new arrival, the camel not yet common in Egypt, though familiar in Mesopotamia. Iron was rare. Copper and bronze still ruled their tools and weapons. They wove linen, cotton, and wool, but silk had yet to find its way to their looms. Glass existed beautifully colored, often delicate, though it remained small and decorative. There were no windows, no lenses, no clear panes to see through. Curiously, they even had gold fillings in their teeth, but no glasses on their noses. A world both ancient and unexpectedly close, shimmering quietly in the past. There is something quietly curious, almost surprising, when we look back at the splendid cities of Thebes and Babylon and realize that one very familiar part of modern life was missing. Money, as we know it, simply did not exist. There were no coins jingling in purses, no stamped currency changing hands in markets. Most trade was still done the old way by barter. Goods were exchanged for other goods, and value was something felt, not counted. Yet even in this, Babylon had taken strides beyond its time. Long before coinage, gold and silver were already being used for exchange not as coins, but as weighed lumps, kept in carefully measured ingots. And in the heart of Babylon's busy streets, the earliest bankers worked. They would stamp their name and the weight onto those solid pieces of metal tokens of trust and trade. A traveling merchant might carry with him not coins, but polished stones or glittering gems, selling them along the way to pay for food or shelter. The world moved at a slower pace, and value was heavier, quite literally. Most of the labor that kept these cities alive came not from paid workers, but from slaves. They were given food, clothing, shelter paid not in money, but in kind. And yet, as the idea of money began to spread across lands and empires, something began to shift. With the rise of coins and wages came a quiet change in the nature of work, and in time, as money replaced barter, the grip of slavery began to loosen. A new kind of freedom, the freedom to earn, was slowly being born. If a traveler from our world, perhaps a curious guest from Paris or New York, could step quietly into the bustling markets of ancient Babylon or stroll through the sunlit courtyards of Thebes, they might marvel at the splendor, but find something surprisingly missing from the table. Two things, in fact, that today seem so ordinary, so ever-present, were nowhere to be found: hens and eggs. Not a single cluck or shell in sight. A French chef, with dreams of omelets and soufflés, would have looked around with quiet dismay. These staples of modern cuisine simply hadn't arrived yet. They were still far away, slowly making their journey from the distant east. And it wouldn't be until the days of the last Assyrian Empire that hens would begin to wander into farmyards and their eggs into kitchens. Until then, even the most lavish feasts of the ancient world were without them, a tiny, tender detail that reminds us how much changes with time and how even the smallest of comforts must first travel long and far before they find a place at the table. Even religion, that deep and ancient force guiding human hearts, had begun to soften and grow more thoughtful with time. Once, in the shadowy beginnings of civilization, it had demanded much even blood. Human sacrifice had been a grim reality, a gift offered to unseen powers. But now, those dark rituals were fading into memory. Instead of human lives, offerings had become more symbolic: the flesh of animals, or even humble figures made of bread, shaped like the ones they once would have taken. Yet not all lands let go so easily. Far to the west, the Phoenicians, and especially the citizens of their mighty African city, Carthage, would later be accused of keeping the old ways, of still offering human lives to flames. In earlier times, when a great chief passed from the world, it was custom to kill his wives and servants, to shatter his weapons at his grave, so that he would not walk alone or unarmed in the afterlife. But in Egypt, even that grim tradition had softened into something almost gentle. Instead of real companions, they buried small, exquisite models beside the dead, tiny figures of servants, cattle, homes, and shops, crafted in loving detail. And so, after thousands of years, these miniature gifts now whisper across time, giving us vivid glimpses of the peaceful, cultivated world these ancient people once knew, and the tenderness with which they imagined the journey beyond. And so, my friends, we stand at the crossroads of time, where one man's journey beneath a tree changed the course of human history. Gautama Buddha didn't just find answers lit a spark that would glow for centuries, touching hearts, shaping minds, and whispering one simple truth: peace is possible. The Eightfold Path wasn't just a teaching, it was a call to action, a roadmap to live with kindness, think with clarity, and walk with compassion. Over 500 years later, that path still guides millions. From the monasteries of Tibet to the streets of modern cities, the Buddha's wisdom lives on. Not in myths or miracles, but in us, in how we choose to live, to love, to let go. So, what's the takeaway? You don't need to be a prince or an ascetic to find your truth. The questions Gautama asked: why do we suffer? How can we find peace? They're your questions too. The answers? They're within you, waiting to be discovered. If this story moved you, if it sparked curiosity about the world and your place in it, hit that subscribe button, smash that like, and ring the bell to never miss a chapter of these epic tales. Share this with someone who needs inspiration today, and let's keep exploring the stories that shaped us together. Until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking, and keep walking your path to peace. This is HS Historian, signing off. Stay curious, stay kind, and I'll see you in the next video.